Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sarah Alexander, and I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. And we're doing a webinar today. Myself, Bill Pluker, who is our public policy organizer at MOFGA, as well as Laura Dumais, who's the staff counsel at the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. We're going to be talking about PFAS. We're going to give a big picture overview and an update on kind of what has happened in Maine over the last number of years. And then we're going to get into the details of our lawsuit that we've joined in coordination with several other plaintiffs that Peer is helping us coordinate. So Laura is going to get into the details on that. And if you want to go to the next slide. Here are our three speakers today. And I'm just going to have Bill and Laura say hello here quickly and just introduce yourself, and then we'll dive in.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I'm Bill Pluker. I'm the public policy organizer for MOFGA. I've also been an organic farmer for about 20 years, and I'm the chair of the Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry Committee in the State House here in Maine.
And I'm Laura Dumais. I'm staff counsel here at Peer, and although I don't have a farm, I am an avid gardener.
Great. Well, thank you both for being on here today and getting into the details of what's going on with the PFAS issue in agriculture. We do have a number of folks joining us today. We're going to ask folks to keep themselves on mute, and if you have questions during the presentation, to please utilize the chat. And we will have time for questions at the end. And so we'll keep track of those questions as they come in, and we'll be able to answer them either as we go or towards the end of our time here today. So I'm going to start out with just a big picture overview, just so we're all on the same page about what we're talking about today. And getting started with what are PFAS. So PFAS is an acronym for a class of chemicals. It stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And it's a class of chemicals that are manufactured and used in a lot of different products across a lot of different uses. So these include both products that we may come into contact with every day, like food packaging, household items, anything that's stain resistant, water resistant, heat resistant. Some of the classic examples are things like Teflon in cookware, or waterproof, outdoor gear, raincoats, hiking boots, that kind of thing. And it's also included in firefighting foam and used in a lot of industrial manufacturing purposes as well. So this class of chemicals has been around for many decades. And has really expanded in its use in our personal care products and things that might be showing up in our household over the last several decades. We're going to go on to the next slide. We today are really talking about PFAS in farming and food and agriculture. So the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, we're one of the country's oldest and largest statewide organic groups. And our mission is to advocate for a healthy and fair food system for everybody. And we do that through supporting farmers, helping empower people to feed their communities, and advocating for an organic future. And 6 years ago, when I took this role, PFAS really wasn't something that was much on our radar, or something that we were really thinking about in agriculture, because it is not an agricultural chemical that is widely known or used. And so in Maine, we started looking at this issue as it came forward, that it was a contaminant on farms. And how it's ending up on farms is mostly through the spreading of sludge, which comes from wastewater treatment centers. This includes both the household waste that might be coming, from each of our households or our septic tanks, that goes into wastewater treatment plants, but it also includes some industrial waste that may also be going into those wastewater treatment plants. And then as that waste is treated at the wastewater treatment plants, there is a resulting product that is a solid. And for several decades, at least here in Maine and throughout the country, that has been used as a cheap source of fertilizer. So it's really been pushed on farms that this could be a win-win for both waste treatment facilities to be able to dispose of this product, but also for farms to be able to have a source of fertility that would help them on their farm. Now, in the state of Maine and really throughout the country, when this practice began, there was no awareness of anything related to PFAS chemicals or other chemicals that may be in biosolids or in wastewater sludge. And it's really only been in the near term, the last couple of decades, that more awareness of this has started to come forward. And here in Maine, it's really been within the last 8 to 10 years that we've started to have awareness that this was an agricultural contaminant. So it does, because these are forever chemicals, they don't break down over time. The same properties that make them heat resistant, water resistant, grease resistant, also in nature make them not really susceptible to breaking down and degrading over time in the ways that we might see with other chemicals. And so they are persistent in our environment and they move throughout the environment. So after they are spread on agricultural lands as a fertilizer, those PFAS chemicals may stay in the soil. Some of them may move into the water system, depending on the soil type, and some of them may also be taken up into plants that are grown on that soil. They can also be turned into dust and inhaled or spread through the environment in that manner as well. And so we do see them move between parts of the ecosystem, between the soil, the water, and then into plants. And then ultimately that may result in them ending up in our food. And we have seen this in Maine, and we've seen it in other parts of the country where studies or research have been done on this. And then that may mean that we are consuming them as well, and they're ending up in us. So if you want to go to the next slide. We wanted to share a little bit for folks who aren't aware about, why has this become such an issue in Maine, and what has been the response in Maine addressing this issue. And so here in Maine, it really started with this courageous farmer, Fred Stone. Through some routine water testing that happened in 2016, there were wells that were found to be contaminated with PFAS. And after doing some looking into that issue to see where was the source of this, it was traced back to a third generation dairy farm in Arundel, Maine, who had spread sludge permitted through the state to be able to spread sludge on his farm, again, as a fertilizer. And this was really the first farm where high levels of PFAS were discovered. At that time, the state really didn't have any programs in place, really didn't have any solutions. And so unfortunately, Fred Stone and his family were really left to deal with this issue on their own. And so Fred became a really vocal advocate and started to really speak out about this issue around 2019. After really seeing the impacts of this on his farm was forced to go out of business. He was not allowed to sell his milk because it was considered contaminated with PFAS. And his own family's health was really jeopardized as part of this exposure and contamination as well. So as Fred began to speak out, there began to be more action in the state, both at the agency levels. So we have several agencies here in the state of Maine that have worked on this issue over the last number of years. But as we'll see, and we'll hear more from Bill, it's really been through advocacy and legislative work that have really put forward the roadmap for how we've dealt with this in the state of Maine. And, we want to express our gratitude for the courage of all of the farmers that have been involved in this issue and really speaking out and showcasing what the situation is on the ground and what the true impact of this contamination is on our communities and on farm families. And Fred Stone here in Maine is really one of the first, or the first farmer who spoke out about this. And we're really grateful for Fred and his family's courage in standing up and fighting back and making us all aware of this issue. So if you want to go to the next slide. So we're going to learn more about what happened in the few years between when Fred started to speak out about this and as the state started to discover more. But really kind of the second wave of awareness of the contamination of farms with PFAS came at the end of 2021 and beginning of 2022, as the state published a map that showed where all of the licenses had been issued to spread sludge in the state, and farms began to investigate for themselves their own risk. So as they saw their farm showing up on the map, several farms had no awareness of prior sludge spreading. The spreading had happened decades prior to the farms even taking ownership of the farms. And yet, because these are forever chemicals, as they saw themselves on the map and started to do their own testing, they did find that their fields and their water were still contaminated with PFAS. And so the next set of farmers that really brought this to our attention and encouraged and advocated for MOFGA and other farm service providers to really get involved and step up here in terms of our advocacy and our work on this issue, were Johanna Davis and Adam Nordell from Songbird Farm. And I'm not sure if they're on today, but Adam and Johanna have both been, again, really courageous in telling and sharing their stories, sharing their own contamination issues within their personal lives as well as their farm. And they had an organic vegetable and grain farm operation in Unity that had been operating since 2014. And without their knowledge, the farm had been spread with sludge almost 2 decades prior to them taking ownership of that. And so there had been a previous organic farmer who had been on that farm before they acquired it. And he wasn't really aware of the sludge issue either. And so this came as a real surprise to them. And unfortunately, the high levels of contamination, both in their soil and their water, did lead to the closure of their farm. And they've been advocating and speaking out since then to really work to make sure this is an issue that other farmers are not only going to be supported in navigating, but that this will not continue to be an issue moving forward. So it's really been through the courageous stories of these farmers that now we're going to shift to talking about the legislation that we've put in place and the roadmap we've had here at the state level, and then leading to action at the federal level, which is leading into the EPA lawsuit that we're joining a part of this week. So MOFGA responded. We heard the community needs from these farmers, and we set up farmer support, including technical assistance, so helping farmers navigate on their own farms what this contamination might mean, how they may need to shift their production, what they may need to do, offering testing support. But prior to the state having an emergency relief fund, we set up a farmer PFAS emergency fund to provide direct income replacement and other direct financial support to impacted farmers, and also provided mental health support through that fund as well. And over the last few years, we've been coordinating across statewide agencies and ag service providers to make sure that we're centering our farmers and our farmers' needs and making sure that we have both the support, but a plan in place for how we can have healthy and safe food and farms for everybody. And we've been advocating at both the state and the federal level for policy change and now legal change in order to have safety nets in place for all of us, for our food, water, and the future of our farms. So now I'm going to hand it over to Bill, who's going to talk us through all of the work that's happened at the state legislature and the roadmap that Maine has put forward for dealing with this issue at the state level.
That's right. Thank you, Sarah. And I'll just run through these in the order. They seem to be in numerical order, but we can go in more in depth as we hit the ones that are perhaps a little bit more important than some of the others. But it's starting with LD 264, which is looking into the use of PFAS and pesticides, is actually where some of our inspiration and collaboration with PEER began, even though they didn't even know it was happening. And that PEER discovered that millions, I think thousands of acres in Massachusetts have been spread with PFAS through the aerial application of pesticides. At that time, it was actually coming, the PFAS was not in the formulation of the pesticide itself, but it was coming from the interaction of the fluoride containing plastic and the pesticide. But unintentionally, they'd spread it across their entire state. When I saw news of that, working together with MOFGA and some other folks, we came up with this idea for LD 264, look at the use of PFAS and pesticides more broadly, especially in aerial applications. And coming out of that bill, we became a study to look at how PFAS is being used in pesticides and exactly how it's being applied. And then in the next slide, we'll go into exactly how we responded to some of those things. And I'll go through all the entire slide previous. There we go. LD 363 extends the statute of limitations for farmers to sue PFAS manufacturers. So that was especially important in the case of Fred Stone. On the books before this bill was passed, it said that you needed to sue within a certain number of years of the date of application of the sludge on your farm, which contained PFAS and contaminated your land and your water and potentially your animals. And we changed the law so that it actually applies to the date of discovery of PFAS in your property, because folks were applying this sludge in the 70s and the 80s with no knowledge whatsoever of the potential contamination. And oftentimes it was discovered, as in the case of Joanna Davis and Adam Nordell, many years later that there's a contamination issue for them. So the statute of limitations now begins from the date of discovery. LD 558 ordered DACF to study how to support PFAS affected farmers. So this is in 2021. So we knew this from Fred Stone. We know this has been going on since 2016, but we're finally getting around to looking at, okay, we know farmers are being affected. We need to have a manner of dealing with the issue and exactly how. There's areas from financial and technical assistance to health, and we need to do an all-encompassing look at exactly how the PFAS contamination on our farms is affecting our communities, the farmers, and the agricultural world. And then LD 1503 bans the use of PFAS in products by 2023. And so at the time, this was first of its kind in the entire country, looking at how the PFAS not just is going from the wastewater treatment plant to the farm into our food, but how is it getting into the wastewater treatment plant in the first place? And what we're seeing is that it's coming through a very large number of consumer products. Some of the ones that are of greatest concern are things like food wrappers and cosmetics, and even sometimes even in the clothing that we're wearing. And so this looks at it and creates a ban on all PFAS use in all consumer products across the board. It was a monumental bill, first of its kind, and really enormous, very wide in scope. And as we continue to talk, we'll talk about how we've limited the scope a little bit and got a little more specific as other states have joined the effort to ban some of these products from use. And also I'll just go back. So the EPA has not taken action on banning sludge, on talking about PFAS and pesticides. In fact, PEER has done amazing work looking at some of the studies the EPA has done of the pesticides and found that there's clear flaws in how they were looking for PFAS. And so oftentimes when they came out and said there is no PFAS in the pesticides, they just weren't looking, or they weren't reporting everything they had found. And so LD 1600 orders the DEP to investigate sites of historical sludge spreading in order to assess the scale of contamination. And this bill was also huge for moving the movement forward. It was the first time we really got a sense of that. I don't know how many folks have seen the map, but all the different sludge application sites in the state of Maine. And we're starting to realize just the scale and scope of what was going to happen, of the contamination in our food supply and our soils. It had created a 4-tier system for looking at the farms, with tier 1 being the most likely to be contaminated and tier 4. And we're still in that process. We're now examining tier 3 and tier 4 sites to try to figure out exactly how widespread this contamination is. And now I'll go to the next slide. LD 1911 actually banned the land application of sludge in Maine. And so we continue to be the only state that has done this. When we looked at sludge, we found that there was PFAS in all of the sludge. Some PFAS had much higher concentrations than others. Generally, this is coming because industrial effluent is going into some of the wastewater treatment plants, and the industrial effluent is much higher in the PFAS contamination than just what is coming out of our bodies. And so then this is being combined to create an enormous quantity of sludge that needs to be disposed of. And the state was marketing it to farmers as a cheap way of fertilizing your fields. And so we banned all land application of sludge in Maine. This continues to be a fight that will be going on nationally, and exactly what is the role of sludge in agriculture. And to be clear also, this kind of sludge application is against organic practices. As an organic farmers, you can't apply sludge, but that doesn't mean organic farmers weren't affected, right? Because oftentimes we bought land that had sludge historically applied, like in Adam Nordell's case, and so we're suffering from it just as much. LD 2019 was the response to that LD 264 that we saw on the previous slide. So after the study had come out from 264, we looked at exactly how are we gonna start dealing with the use of pesticides containing PFAS in Maine. And so mirroring the LD 1503, we decided we would ban it by 2030. At this point, it's now been pushed off to 2032. And we're continuing, that CNN just did another report that many of the pesticides that we're using have PFAS in them. That PFAS is going into our vegetables and going onto our fruit. And so limiting the use of PFAS and pesticides is core to trying to keep our water safe as well as our food supply. The other piece of that we did was we broadened the scope of pesticides to include the word adjuvants, or what are adjuvants, which are things which are mixed with pesticides to make them more effective in sticking on plants and that kind of thing. And oftentimes there's a lot of PFAS in the adjuvants. So we did all of that. We also set up a $60 million fund for impacted farmers in Maine. And this started as a LD coming through the legislature, and eventually was picked up by the governor and put directly into her budget. And this fund does a lot of the things that we always dreamed of doing. So income replacement for farmers who are affected and no longer could sell the food in the market any longer. Looking at the health concerns for communities and farmers themselves, doing technical assistance so they could look at, okay, maybe I cannot sell corn anymore, or I can't do corn silage anymore because PFAS is taken up into the stalk of the plant. But now I can, but I might be able to sell tomatoes or flowers or something of that sort. Or you look at your fields and you see that one section of the field has very high PFAS contamination and another has none. So it means you need to restrict and change the way you grow. And yeah, so it's been a lifeline for many farmers in Maine. We've seen more than 59 farmers have come back, or farms come back with high levels of contamination. And only 5 have had to go out of business, largely because of the work of this farm or this fund. And then we have, I will talk more about this, but the Relief for Farmers Hit with PFAS Act is on the federal level and introduced in 22, I believe, by House Rep Pingree and Senator Collins in the Senate. And we'll go more into, and that bill mirrors largely what the fund that we've set up in Maine, and that MOFGA's fund itself, the original fund came from MOFGA, mirrors what they do and what they've been able to accomplish. But we want to do this on the federal level for all farmers. Just as Sarah was saying, when farmers have a safety net, they feel the courage to be able to step forward and talk about what's going on for them, because they are putting their businesses on the line. And some of those folks can become frontline advocates for themselves and for their communities that legislators will listen to. And I can go to the next slide. And then this year, so LD 1537 was a bill that amended that original 1503, which was the blanket product ban. Originally it banned these products in 2030. It extends the fundamental, the kind of baseline ban into 2032. Goes into a lot more detail than that original 1503 went into. Several of the good things that it does from the outset is that it immediately bans certain classes of consumer products like cosmetics, food wrappers, carpeting in the house, treated furniture, And then other things that it does is it says that we're not going to worry about regulating cars, trains, automobiles, and things like that, which have very complicated manufacturing processes that are global in scale. And it's very difficult to identify exactly what kind of chemical makeup some of the rubber and plastic that are used in some of these products are. We don't come in direct contact necessarily with everything in an engine in a car. And so those have been exempted. The carpeting and the furniture inside of a car or plane or train are continue to be regulated. From MOFGA's perspective, I want just talk briefly to the LD 1960 is the role of pesticides in some of these things. And in LD 1537, it did exempt the use of veterinary medicines from the ban. So we'll continue to be working on that issue as we go forward and looking exactly what the role of PFAS in veterinary medicines should be in our food supply. LD 1960 was also a response to the earlier LD 264 and LD 2019, which banned the use of pesticides in our food production, agricultural production. This was an attempt to undo that ban, and we successfully fought against it to keep the ban in place. Going forward, we expect to see these kinds of attacks on existing law to continue. And then LD 2066 limited farmer liability for past sludge applications. And this is important because these farmers, as we've said, this was historical application. They didn't do that themselves. They are suffering the consequences of it. And we need to do everything we can to make it so that they can safely come forward and talk about the contamination they're facing. They are not the ones who are responsible for the contamination of the food and around them. And so also a very important bill. All right, and then as we look forward, we are currently working to put a fund similar to what the one MOFGA has and the one the state of Maine has into the federal level. And that's the Relief for Farmers Hit with PFAS Act. It is currently a marker bill in both the House and the Senate, introduced by Pingree and Collins. We are continuing to work with our federal delegation as well as delegations from other states to try to get that included in the farm bill that's under conversation. Is more than likely a more than a year-long effort to make sure that farmers have that safety net behind them. Sarah, did you want me to talk about the lawsuit?
Why don't we let Laura get into the details of that shortly, but do you want to talk about our push to also get FDA to regulate this? Yeah, so the FDA is in charge of our food, and while the DACF or the USDA is in charge of the production, actually what goes into our food system is coming from the FDA. And so it's very important that they look at what is in our food and what PFAS is in our food and how it is getting there. We all have PFAS in our bodies. 98% of the United States public has PFAS in our bodies. And most of us have it at a level that some sort of health, there will be some sort of health implication to us in the long term from the contamination in our bodies. And a very large source of that is coming from our food production. And so, moving FDA to take action to regulate PFAS in our food is going to be hugely important, and we'll continue with that conversation. We're also going to continue having that conversation on the state level.
All right, thanks, Bill. So I'm Laura Dumais from PEER. PEER is a small but mighty organization that works with public employees from the federal, state, and local level who are seeing environmental problems within their organizations, within their agencies that the agencies are not properly addressing. And so they come to us and we work with them to address those problems. In recent years, PEER has gotten hugely involved in PFAS issues, from containers to pesticides to artificial turf to biosolids. Now, this case that we have against EPA now that MOFGA is joining was originally brought by a group of ranchers in Texas whose land and water had been contaminated by PFAS that was coming actually from a neighboring property where biosolids were spread. They actually have a separate tort lawsuit against the manufacturer of the biosolids, but we are suing on their behalf, EPA, and also MOFGA, as well as Johnson County, Texas, which is the county that they live in, which has done just an absolutely tremendous job of investigating contamination and helping just spread the word about what's going on and looking into national solutions. So before I get into the lawsuit itself, I just want to give those ranchers, just to give you their perspective. We did a short video that we want to show you, the perspective of the ranchers, what happened to them.
I'm James Farmer.
I am Robin Alessi, and we are ranchers in Grandview, Texas.
So basically, I started getting this real smoky air and this god awful smell, and I kind of went and started investigating what was going on across the room from me. And I noticed all these great big huge piles of stuff smoking, and the smell was so putrid, it was just, it almost make you throw up. And a few weeks later, we had gotten a massive rain, and all my fish floated and died. And as time went on, I started losing animals. I started losing horses and cattle and different birds and various things on my farm. So, you know, it's really got me concerned of what in the world is that.
Before the biosolids were laid on the property across the road and the exposure to our property, we had never really had any experience with animals passing so rapidly. If they did, we thought it was natural progression. Then we have 2 horses die within 2 weeks. We have baby calves dying as their firstborn. Our peacocks healthy one day, just laying on the ground the next day. Sand cranes along our ponds eating our fish, dead. No, you know, there's no explanation why. They look fine. There's not like they were taken by a critter or anything like that. And of course, all the fish that we supplied into the waters, all gone. And we don't know the explanation. At the time, we certainly did. Now we're getting more knowledgeable.
So we had a detective come out, and she done some investigation and got some tests done for us. Basically, the results of the test came back were terrifying levels from my fish, from my cows, from my horses, from my water levels, and from my soil samples. And it's just unbelievable the amount of PFAS that's in all this.
It's amazing they've let this happen, not only in Texas, but everywhere in the United States. We bought this property with as a dream fulfilled, and now we have no future that's something we can count on. We really don't know where we're going. We've kind of lost our dream. We're afraid for our animals. We're afraid for our health. And we really need the EPA to get more involved and regulate this better and, you know, help the people and the livestock that keeps this country going.
Thanks, Jennifer. You can go to the next slide. This picture is just from their farm, some of their animals on their farm. So, you know, that's the $1 million question, is why on earth is this allowed? Why is EPA allowing this? And the answer is that it shouldn't. It should have been regulating this PFAS in sewage sludge a long time ago, because of a provision of the Clean Water Act. And I want to talk a little bit about how that provision came to be. So before the late 1980s, for a long time, this country had just been dumping a lot of our sewage sludge straight into the ocean. Just take it out on barges, a certain amount of space, a certain amount of distance from the shore, and plop it in. And unsurprisingly, that was creating a lot of problems in the oceans. And so they banned ocean dumping, and they thought, well, why don't we just take out the pathogens? We will spread it on land as fertilizer, use all those nutrients. It'll be a win-win. And so when they did that, Congress put into the Clean Water Act a provision that would require EPA to make sure that that sewage sludge that was going to be spread all over our nation's farms was safe. And so EPA needed to identify toxic chemicals and regulate them. And then in the same provision, it also required EPA to re-examine those regulations every 2 years to see if there's anything else they needed to add or regulate. And if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense, right? Because technology is always improving. You know, scientists may be able to detect things in soil that they couldn't have detected before, or in the sewage sludge. Substances that we used to think were safe, you know, science can discover they actually do have health impacts that we didn't realize. And of course, there can be new substances, new pharmaceuticals, new chemicals that industry is using. And all of these things are getting into our wastewater streams. So EPA is supposed to be doing these biennial, that means that once every 2 year reviews. They didn't start doing them until 2004, 2005. And then they've been doing them since then. But the problem is that they have been reviewing them and adding lots and lots of chemicals to this long list of chemicals that are in sewage sludge that are dangerous, but they have not really regulated almost any of those chemicals. So all of those chemicals are a problem. However, for this specific lawsuit, we are focused on only PFAS because of how dangerous they are and because of how persistent they are in the environment, how once they're spread, as you can see, for decades and decades, they impact the ability of, you know, the farmers to grow crops on that land. So, and you can go to the next slide now, or to the next, yeah. So basically the gist of this lawsuit is we have identified 18 PFAS that we think that should be on the EPA's biennial list, that they are known to be present in biosolids, and EPA has never said that they are. And then it also identifies 11 PFAS for which we believe EPA has adequate information to regulate them right now. No new studies, no more information gathering. There's so much information on these chemicals and how they're absorbed into the soil and into the land and into our bodies that we think EPA needs to do it. And we would like EPA to be on a schedule where the court is requiring it to do this. This is the gist of our lawsuit. I'm very passionate about this issue. I could talk about it all day, but I know that we need to leave the floor open for questions. I just want to thank MOFGA. I want to thank Johnson County, which has done such an amazing job, and also the ranching families. You saw James and Robin, also Tony and Karen Coleman and Patsy Schultz for being so courageous and coming forward with this, because this is impacting farms across the country and EPA needs to get on it as soon as possible.
Well, thank you, Laura. And if folks have questions, please put them in the chat. Laura, I'll start with a question that I've been getting, and I know how I've been answering it, but folks are asking, you know, what is the ultimate goal of our lawsuit, especially in light of the fact that, you know, farms already have contamination from sewage sludge. Can you just share, you know, how you would describe what our ultimate goal of the lawsuit is?
The ultimate goal of this lawsuit is future focus. So to get the EPA to start regulating PFAS and sewage sludge so that it won't be allowed to be in there. So any sewage sludge that's spread on field doesn't contain PFAS that we know to be dangerous. That's the focus. And then there are other initiatives that are helping farmers, as you know, you all are working on, and on the national level as well, to help them that have already been contaminated.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Deb is asking in the chat, is there any viable remediation? And I can share, you know, what we're aware of here in Maine. So every farm is a different picture, and every farm may be producing different things, or may have different contamination levels, or different variables that they're dealing with. But generally, we have found that there is really great water remediation in terms of carbon filtration. And so most of the farms and households that we're dealing with, if their water is contaminated, their drinking water, they're able to get water filtration on that to remediate that. That does require long-term monitoring and has to be actively maintained. But irrigation water is a bigger challenge and poses different issues in terms of filtration and remediation, although there are some, you know, solutions that some of our farms are looking at, like filtering water into irrigation ponds that can then be utilized, or drilling new wells, potentially looking for sources of water that is not contaminated. When it comes to soil remediation, there is not really a long-term viable, scalable solution for removing the PFAS from the soil. But what we are finding, and what our fund and our state support has been helping farms with, is adapting their production to be able to work around the contamination that they have, depending on, again, the scope and the scale and the specific picture on their farm. So if the contamination level is at a place where they can grow other crops that may not be as impacted, as we mentioned earlier, different plants and different crops take up PFAS differently. And so we know that PFAS doesn't accumulate as much in the fruit or the grain or the root crop vegetables as it does in the leafy green part of the plant. So somebody who was maybe growing hay or using that land for pasture land, you know, may be able to grow corn or something else that will take up the PFAS less than the green part of the plant. But again, it's every farm is going to be different, and that's why we really do need a robust safety net in place, both to help figure out any particular situation on a farm or their surrounding communities. I also want to mention, and I know this, you know, may have been the case in Texas, that not only is it the farm where the sludge was being spread or stored, but that in Maine, and we know nationally, there are many neighboring farms and households that are also really impacted by this, because the PFAS does move through our water systems and through our ecosystems. And not only are our farms and people impacted, but wildlife and other parts of the ecosystem are also impacted. So here in Maine, we've found wildlife, deer, turkeys, other game to have high levels of PFAS contamination, as well as our fish, both our freshwater fish and the other parts of the marine ecosystem that are related to these impacted waterways. Bill or Laura, do you want to add anything else around remediation?
I think you covered it. I can't think of another piece to it. Besides, there's, you know, experimental things happening with hemp and birch trees and mushrooms, but nothing solid just yet.
Yeah, and I think that gets to the next question, which is, do we know if there are lower levels in the soil after a leafy crop draws PFAS into it? And I know there are some studies being done on this, as well as bioremediation, like Bill mentioned with hemp. The one challenge with that is that because the PFAS don't break down, now they're just in a new substance, so plant material, for example, that needs to be dealt with or disposed of in a safe manner, so we don't just continue the cycle of contamination. So I think an earlier question was about what are we doing with the sludge in Maine that was formerly spread on farmland. and that is currently going into the landfill here in Maine. But we know that there need to be other long-term research and solutions figured out for PFAS contaminated sludge or other products so that they can be safely disposed of and not continue the cycle of contamination that we're seeing currently. Other folks can feel free to add more questions into the chat. Laura or Bill, other things that you would want to add in related to the cycle of PFAS contamination?
Yeah, I would just say that like the ultimate solution to this is banning all non-essential uses, because it's otherwise still going to be coming down the wastewater system. And so, you know, you either land apply it, you put it in a landfill, or you burn it. And all of those have problems. I mean, we shouldn't be making it in the first place, but we're still probably a ways from that dream becoming a reality, but I think we'll get there someday, I hope.
I think there are also, you know, there are steps in the process. So one of the big problems that really contaminates our sludge is when we're combining the industrial sludge along with the sludge from our cities, and that just increases the toxic contamination coming from the PFAS. So it's kind of a really fundamental level of how we handle processing of waste in our cities, and we need to make sure there's like two different systems, so it's all not going to the same place. And I think in terms of what really motivates me in this work is that there are people who are getting rich from the manufacturers, the industries, the corporations, from the manufacture of PFAS and the selling of PFAS. And they're making money because we are, as farmers or we as consumers, are suffering the impacts of the products they're producing. And it's just not fair to the people, that there are some who are terribly wealthy and others who are going to be suffering from cancer or whatever else may come for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, thank you, Laura and Bill. Definitely, we want to turn off the tap on PFAS so that it's not getting into our waste streams. And then we certainly don't want farmers or other folks downstream to be left holding the bag of this contamination. So, you know, we know this is a national issue. There are farms all across the country that are contaminated with PFAS, whether they've been able to investigate that or not, or whether that's you know, something that folks are aware of. I think the Environmental Working Group estimates that sludge has been applied to over 22 million acres nationally within the US. And so, and that's just from sludge, PFAS contamination from sludge spreading. But I will also mention there are other industrial uses in sites like firefighting foam and defense sites and other applications that may also be contaminating farms or communities' drinking water with PFAS. Tracy's just adding a couple of comments into the chat here around what Bill was saying related to industrial wastewater and having a separate treatment system for that to make sure that there's pre-treatment of that industrial wastewater before it may be going into other waste streams. And then recognizing that PFAS is just one class of contaminants in sewage sludge. And as Laura mentioned, there are many, many other chemicals that are also in this, even though we're only talking about PFAS today, as that is the purpose of our lawsuit, is to get the EPA to regulate PFAS in sludge under the Clean Water Act. Well, we might have time for one more question. If anybody wants to put one in the chat here, I see one coming in. And while we're just taking a look at that, I'll also ask Jennifer to put in some links. I think we had a link to Peer's website earlier. We also have some links to some actions for learning more about PFAS, as well as taking action to both ask the EPA to regulate PFAS in sludge, but to also ask the FDA to regulate it in food, and ask your member of Congress to support the Relief for Farmers Hit with PFAS Act. So Larry from Johnson County, and Larry, thank you for your work and thank you for being on today, asking about what avenues are available to the ranchers in the event that their cattle are condemned and have to be euthanized. In the Clovis, New Mexico dairy case, 4,000 head were euthanized, but apparently USDA has an indemnity program for dairies, but not beef cattle. I've reached out to our congressman, but no answers yet. And Larry, you have hit the nail right on the head there, in that there are not any federal safety net programs for our farmers except for dairy farmers. There is the dairy indemnity program, which has been expanded to allow PFAS contamination as an adulterant that will cover limited income replacement for dairy farmers that have PFAS contamination and may have to euthanize animals, but there is not currently a federal safety net for any other type of farming or production. And so that's why we're advocating, and we hope everybody here on the call today will take action to ask your members of Congress to support the Relief for Farmers Hit with PFAS Act. And that would allow states to access over $500 million in funds that would directly work with those farms to replace their income for lost sales, but would also pay for what needs to happen on the farm, whether it's euthanizing animals, getting a new herd, bringing in clean water or feed, making infrastructure changes, or ultimately, if the farm contamination is at a level where it's not viable to continue farming there, even allowing for the buyout of that farm. So those farmers, just as we heard in the video, this is the life dream for so many of these folks that are working as ranchers and farmers and on this land. We want to continue to see them ranching and farming, and they should have an opportunity to start over if ultimately the location where they're at has contamination levels that are not viable for future production. So all of that can happen. That is what we've put in place here in Maine. We have seen farm buyouts that are in action, as well as those income replacements and infrastructure support so farms can pivot and stay in business. We want to see these farms continuing to farm. We want to see them be successful. We know that every farmer and rancher wants to produce healthy, safe food for our communities, and we can support them in that goal. We know that we can take action and we can make a real difference on this issue. And again, encourage folks to go to the websites and take action there. And just one final comment, that if we were regulating PFAS, that would also help with the sewage sludge issue. So yeah, thank you everybody for participating today, for asking your questions, for listening in, and please help spread the word more broadly, encourage people to take action and help really raise awareness around this issue, because it is a national issue, and we know ultimately every state is going to be dealing with this, and we need federal guidelines and regulations and safety nets in place so that our farmers and our ranchers can be supported. So thank you all, and we hope you have a great afternoon.